I preached this a long time ago at a women's conference. I made some changes, but the message is so important, and it's not just for women. So guys, this is not a woman's message, but it is about a woman in the Bible. If you'll join me in Esther. Esther is one of my sheroes. She is an amazing, amazing woman. And you know, the thing is, she lived in a time when women weren't allowed to have much of an opinion or a role or anything else. But she did God's work in her time and in her place. And I respect her because Esther saved her people, not as a warrior, not as a preacher. Some of us are preachers in here, and you know what I'm talking about. As a woman, it's not always easy. I was in a denomination that's kind of rough on women, but fortunately I had some women that went before me, and they fought the real battles. And I just came in, and God just blessed me in my ministry. But Esther didn't fight that kind of battle. Esther fought with the tools that she was given. And the tools for her period in life were submission to her husband. It was being a woman of God, being a meek and having that meek and quiet spirit, and doing what she was supposed to do. Not stand up and rage and fighting them, my people, but she obeyed God. She obeyed, like we discussed in the Sunday school. We had a great Sunday school class this morning on submission. Basically, dealt a lot with submission, and I'm a big believer in submission. I'm a big believer in it. But I'm not a believer in everybody submitting to everybody unless that's your role and that's where you're supposed to. But we're supposed to submit to those people that God puts in authority over us. And I believe that. And this is what she did. This woman changed her world and fought an enemy that was determined to kill every Jew just by obeying God, listening to her uncle when he said these words that I take to heart and love. For such a time as this. For such a time as this. How do you know that you were not brought into the kingdom for such a time as this? How do you know that God didn't put you in your circumstances? Or that you didn't get in your circumstances because you put yourself there, but God allowed it for such a time as this? Because God's got a call and God's got a plan. And He takes those things in our life. He takes those lemons, some of the lemons that we create. How many of you created a few of your own lemons? You know, I can't always say God did this, but I can say God took it. And God made it better. And God made my life better for it. My kids used to wonder, Michael and I, we have been in a lot of positions. We have served at the state level and different kind of levels and all this stuff. And we have put up with some stuff. We had a church board. Our district superintendent had planted somebody into our church, on our church board, who was the watchdog. And he was there for one purpose, and that was to do everything he could to create tension in the church. Sometimes he even prayed, but it was a challenge. And when it was all over with, we looked back, we went on down the road, we went through all the stuff we went through, eventually resigning the church and going through all this stuff. When it was all over with, God took us down a different road. And my kids were like, why did you not kill these people? Why do you put up with it? Why do you tolerate it? I remember Michael was one of those. Mom, why? Why you and Daddy didn't, what can you do? What can you do? Trust God. And so we did, and God took us down another road. And then what I always look back on was, had we not experienced that, we would have never been who we are today. We would have never been where we are today. And I am so grateful to God because He allowed us to go down some bumpy roads. Because, people that don't go down bumpy roads don't have much. She went down some bumpy roads. Her uncle said to her, how do you know that you were not brought into the kingdom for such a time as this? We, ladies and gentlemen, have been brought into the kingdom for such a time as this. Esther chapter 4, verse 10. Again Esther spake unto Hatach, and gave him command unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and people of the king's province do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to one who the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the kingdom these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and the deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come into the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther, we all know the story. I'm sure most everybody in here knows the story of Queen Esther. She was put in there, and with all the virgins in the kingdom, the king's wife stepped up, and she wouldn't obey. The king called her, and he had all of his counsel there, and he said, I want my wife to come in because I want to show her off. I want to show her. Vishti, I think, was her name. And he wanted to show up her beauty. And she's like, not going to happen. So his counselors said, if you let her get by with that, then every husband in the kingdom will have a rebellious wife. And so he got rid of her, and he was looking for a new wife. And he got all the virgins in the kingdom. And they had 6 months of oils and 6 months of bath and all these things that they went through. And, of course, we know that Esther was the chosen one. And then there arose Haman, one of the king's men, that wanted to destroy the Jews. And so what he did, he said, I'm not sure if I got his name right, but anyway, what he did, he decided, he went to the king, and he said, what do we do about people that don't follow the rules and da-da-da? And the king listened to him and decreed that the Jews would be killed at a certain time, at a certain day. And Mordecai, her uncle, said to her, go talk to the king. He'll listen to you. He sent her the message. Go talk to him. And she's like, whoa, hey, anybody that goes before the king and steps into his presence and he hasn't called them in, if he doesn't point the scepter and tell them that they can come in, they are dead. And he hasn't called me for over 30 days. I don't think so. Not going to happen. This old girl, I know where my bread is buttered. And Mordecai sent the message back to her. And he said, do you really think that you won't pay yourself? You're a Jew. You too will pay the price. And if you don't do this, God is going to save the Jews. But you and your house won't be saved. And how do you know that you're not brought into the kingdom for such a time as this? Have you ever thought about those words? I was brought into the kingdom for such a time as this. I live in a warped world. I live in a world that makes no sense. Our world has been turned upside down, and everything that we valued 15 or 20 years ago is gone. And if you value those things today, then there's something wrong with you according to this world. Why was I not born and lived my life back in the 40s and 50s when it was a whole lot more fun and a whole lot less stressful? Maybe because God had a plan. Maybe because God said, now if you listen to my oldest son, he will say that all the angels were lined up and all of them were asked who wants to be Sharon Schutz's child. And all the angels stepped back, but he wasn't listening. And he was the only one, and so he got stuck with the job. But that's not the way it worked. That's just what he tells everybody. But we were all born into this world for a purpose, for a plan, for a moment, for such a time as this. For such a time as this. You know, you can look back in history. I love history. I love history. And you can look back with in the Old Testament, and you can look at Noah. Noah was born and lived in a culture for such a time as this. Now, you see, everybody thinks that Noah was so perfect in all his ways. And so, therefore, God saved him and his family because they didn't have any sin in their lives. That's not true. I mean, I'm not saying they were big sinners, but their DNA was still pure and hadn't been destroyed by Satan. And he had been destroying at that point. There were giants in the land, and the giants and the men and women were mingling with the giants, and all this was, they were commingling, and it was destroying the DNA, and it was destroying the ability for God to have a pure race to bring Jesus through. And so he pulled Noah out, and he said, "Build a ship, because I'm going to wipe everybody else out. You're the only one left that has pure DNA. And that still knows me, that's still here." And so he did. For such a time as this, God raised up a man and his wife and his sons and their wives. And he saved the world through one man. Abraham. We know what Abraham was the grandfather of all the Jews. We know the story, how he was married to Sarah. In their old age, God gave them a child. In his time, for such a time as this. So many times, Moses and David, so many people that God raised up in his word. In the New Testament, we have person after person who was raised up for their time. They served God in the church where he placed them. But then, after the church, there was a whole lot more people. And I love these. We all know about Moses and Noah and Abraham and all this. We know about those. But I want to bring some to light, some that I think are pretty cool. At the end of the 19th century to the 20th century, there was a woman named Mary Boddy. Mary Boddy, B-O-D-D-Y. She was from Sutherland, England. She died in 1928. I know most of us didn't have a lot to do with her or her family or her descendants or even know who she was. But she and her husband pastored and were instrumental in one of the biggest revivals that ever hit England, went across England, across Europe, back into the United States. One of the biggest revivals that ever hit the Western culture. This woman and her husband were at the heart of it, because they were put on this planet for such a time as this, in their life, in their place where God put them. She laid hands. How many of you know who Smith Wigglesworth is? Good. Smith Wigglesworth was a plumber. He was real tall, and his wife was a preacher. His wife did most of the preaching, and he would go with her some when she preached. But otherwise, he'd be going off to the plumbing, doing his plumbing job. And so God finally called him to the ministry, and his wife died. And he grieved. He was so angry. He was like, "Why did you take her?" And so he prayed, and he said, he asked God to bring her back to life, and God did. God brought her back to life. And she told him, "I don't want to be back here." And she died again. She loved heaven. And God took him, after he took his wife, God took Smith Wigglesworth down a road of learning. And this man was one of the most profound beginners of the Pentecostal movement, of the movement of the revival that hit the turn of this last century, at the beginning of the last century. She laid hands on him. Mary Boddy laid hands on Smith Wigglesworth, and Smith Wigglesworth changed the world. Now, I'm telling you, I don't even know who this woman was, but I do know who Smith Wigglesworth was. I've read every book that's been written about him. I've read every word that he's never wrote a book himself, but there's a lot of books out there that are based on his messages. And if you ever have a chance to read anything about Smith Wigglesworth, do it. I encourage it. This man was one of the most godly men. He did not go more than 15 minutes at any time without reading his Bible. He carried his Bible everywhere he went. He was not pompous. He was not a glory-seeking, but he would not go for 15 minutes without reading his Bible, unless he was preaching or something. But just when he was in his daily life, he would get on a train, And when he walked down the aisle of the train, which was a big mode of transportation in those days, he would walk down the aisle of the train, and brother, people would fall out on the floor crying and weeping and saying, God, save me, forgive me, Father, just because Smith Wigglesworth walked by. It wasn't Smith Wigglesworth. He was just a man who was born for such a time as this. But he was a man who loved God. He was a man who recognized his role in the place God put him. He was a man who recognized eternity was real, and eternity is forever, and eternity is going to be right there in front of every one of us one day. It might be 40 years for some of us. It might be 4 minutes for some of us. But we will step into eternity. And whatever we do on this side of eternity, we take it with us. And Smith Wigglesworth understood that for such a time as this. Let me tell you what, Amy Semple McPherson, who knows that name? She was the head of the founder of the Foursquare Church. And that's a pretty good church organization. I've never really been involved with them, except we've had association with them in our youth organization. But within just a short time, a few years after she started the Foursquare, there were 1.5 million people that were fed during the Depression, that was fed through the Foursquare Church. 1.5 million people. The Church of the Way, by how many of you heard of Jack Hayford? The Church of the Way, Foursquare Church. He was one of her disciples. He was one of her disciples who understood, Brother Jim, that he was born for such a time as this. For such a time as this. Esther heard what Mordecai said. She heard what he said. And she said in verse 16, she said, and if I perish, I perish. How many of us are willing to step up and know that because of what I do for God right now, I could die? I got news. There are people all over the world that are dying and choosing death rather than recanting of their relationship with Christ. And it's coming to America. If you don't believe it, if you haven't seen it, if you can't feel it and know it's happening, then get your head out of the sand and pay attention, because you were born for such a time as this. We don't have anything guaranteed beyond this breath there. And I could drop dead, as any one of us can. And we were put on this earth for such a time as this. She was willing to die for what she believed. And most of us aren't even willing to live for what we believe. I'm telling you, we all will say, oh yeah, they put a gun to my head and said, recant of Jesus or die. Most of us are, yeah, I would, oh, buddy, I would, But would you? Would you really? Would you say, if I perish, I perish? But I was put here for such a time as this. I was put here to live in Trinity, Texas in 2016. I was put here, Brother Jim, to be in this church on whatever this date is. It's August something. August 28th, 2016. For such a time as this. For such a time as this. I'm going to tell you, if every breath we take, we know could be our last one. And this is not fear-mongering. If you think I'm fear-mongering, then hang around with me for a while, because I'll show you fear-mongering. I will show you what's going on in the world. I will pull up some stuff that's going on in the world. I will tell you some details because I know them, but I won't. There's no point, Brother Jim. People don't want to hear it. They don't. They can't change it. They can't stop it. You know what I'm talking about. They can't fix anything, but we can pray. We can serve God. We can look at God and say, God, I can't control who's in Washington. I can't control what they do once they get there. I can't control whether they tell the truth before they get in there or not. I can't control any of it, but I can control one thing, and only one thing. I can control me. I can control my reaction. I say to people sometimes, and they look at me really funny, but it's true. God does not care nearly as much about what you go through as he does about your reaction to it. He will allow you to go through this world barefoot and walk on glass if it's what it will take to bring you to that place in him where he will know you. Will He put you on the glass? No, most of us put ourselves in those dumb spots. But He'll protect you. He'll surround you with angels to make sure you don't get killed while you're on the glass. And then once you get on there, you'll start hollering, oh, God, help me get off this stuff. It's killing me, God. And then He'll reach out and He'll change it. Because He cares. He cares. Audrey, God cares. He cares so much that He sent His only Son. Oh, you guys, what Jesus did, it wasn't some thing that just, it was an idea that happened. It was planned. Because He knew, they knew, and they understood what humanity was. Jesus understood, Brother Jim, that these men that were around Him were all a bunch of phonies, and they were just following Him because He fed them. He understood that, but He died anyway. He laid there, and He died for such a time as this. For such a time as this. Oh, guys, we don't have a long time. We don't have a long time. I was reading this, it's called The Ministry of the Towel. It was written by Richard J. Foster. I put my glasses on so it'll make it a little bit easier, and I might get the words right. Gathered at the Passover feast, the disciples were keenly aware that someone needed to wash the other's feet. The problem was that the only people who washed feet were the least. So there they sat, feet caked with dirt. It was such a sore point that they were not even going to talk about it. No one wanted to be considered the least. Then Jesus took a towel and a basin and redefined greatness for such a time as this. You guys are here for a season, a short season. You're going to go back to your lives. You're going to go back to wherever you come from, and you're going to step into that old life. And God has put you here for such a time as this. For such a time as this, God has brought us to this place. Why, when, where, who, how? I don't know any of the details about any of us. But I do know this one thing. I know my God. Brother Jim, I know my God. I know my God. Sometimes I don't understand why. Sometimes I don't understand why God doesn't do things the way I want them done, because He just cannot figure it out what I want done, and He will not listen. But I found out a long time ago, if I just go on and let Him be God, I'll look back and I'll go, whoa, if I got what I wanted, my life would have been a real mess. But He had me in a situation for just a time as this. We're in this kingdom for such a time as this. Joel 2:28 says, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. This was done in the upper room. We all know the story. They had a lot of people in that room, but eventually they called out, and then there was the serious ones that were left. They were up there for 10 days, and the Holy Spirit was poured out into that room, and they had the tongue of fire sat upon the people, and they prayed, and they spoke in tongues, and they did all this, and the world was changed at that moment. The world was changed. And I'm not going to get into why the 10 days or what was going on outside of that room, but there was a lot going on outside of that room up in heaven. Jesus was taking care of details because He had a plan. And it was all part of the plan. It was also done in the early part of the last century. Smith Wigglesworth was part of it. There were so many. Andrew Murray. I don't know. Who knows who Andrew Murray is? Woo, let me tell you. Andrew Murray is one of my best friends. I have two. I have two very dear, dear friends. Andrew Murray and Watchman Nee. Andrew Murray died in 1920. Watchman Nee died in 1972. I never met either one of them. But I read every word they ever wrote. I read every book that had their name attached to it anywhere. Because these men know and knew God. They understood God. Andrew Murray understood the relationship with God so much that he makes you just want to be in God's presence, and you would read his work, and it would be so exciting to read his stuff. I cannot stand anything that was written after 1940. Very little will I read after 1940, because most of that's junk. And the more I get to know about the people that wrote that stuff after 1940, 1950, 1960, junk. And their older lives prove it. But Watchman Nee was born in China. He got saved at 17 years old. He was a preacher back before the communists took over. He was amazing. He wrote a book, The Spiritual Man. And if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's a 3-part book series. It's amazing, amazing book. I have gone through 3 sets. Absolutely worn them out. I've worn most of those books out over and over and rebuy them and wear them out, because these are my friends. I trust what they say. And they were born for such a time as this in their own lives. And they pass that knowledge on down to us today. And those of us that are smart find that knowledge and find out how to get a hold of God and find out. But Watchman Nee, let me tell you, I want to finish just about him, because I know I'm about to close here just in a minute. But Watchman Nee put in prison in 1952. He spent 20 years in prison in China. And I'm not talking about with big screen TV. I'm talking about China, prison, communist China, for being a Christian. He was in prison for 20 years and died in prison in 1972. And that man changed China. His words that he wrote changed the world of anybody who finds them and reads them and learns and studies and understands. Because he not only, where Andrew Murray gets you excited about doing the things of God, Watchman Nee teaches you how and why. He's the nuts and bolts and the screws, and then Andrew Murray is he's the one that puts the polish on the outside. They're my friends. They're my friends. And they were born and lived during the last century. And they were born in a time that God had planned to bring to pass what he's bringing to pass today. It's been done throughout the centuries, and it's been done now. Every moment and every event of every man's life on earth plants something in his soul. Did you hear that? Did you hear that? Everything in your life plants something. I had some friends. No, I won't say I had friends, because they weren't my friends. Eventually, God taught me how to love them. They weren't even nice. They were in the church. It was all a new thing. I'm not going to get into it, but we were in church, and they were teaching this prayer thing. It was supposed to be a prayer meeting, but it was a 55 minutes of them teaching us how to pray and 5 minutes of us praying. And the stuff that they taught was weird. It was really weird. And I was just new enough in the Christian experience and this part of the experience that I knew what I knew, but this stuff didn't make sense. So I was sitting there, and I said, I know exactly what you mean. He said, really? I said, yeah. I said, it's like when I have a flat on my truck. We drove it wasn't a Jeep, it was a Bronco. I said, when I have a flat on my Bronco or whatever, I'm learning how to not let it ruin my day. I'm learning how to give it to God, how to let God be in control of it, and my reaction. And they went, and his wife goes, oh, she's talking about the physical. No. We're talking about the spiritual. And I went, what's the difference? What is the difference? Oh, well, the spiritual is, and then there's, no. If it happens in your life, if it affects you, if it touches your body, if it touches your children, if it touches your life in any way, it affects you spiritually. For such a time as this, God brought you into the kingdom. And God's got a plan for each of us. And his plan, I have no idea what it is. I don't. I have a hard enough time trying to figure out what he's got for me to do. And I've been in the ministry for over 30 years. And he still won't tell me. It's like every time I think we got it figured out, he changes something. But I do know this one thing. I am in this kingdom for such a time as this. And I know that I'm put here for one purpose, and that is to touch the lives of the people that God puts around me and teach them how to be here for such a time as this. That's why we exist, is it not, Pastor? That's what the ministry is about. The ministry is about reaching others, and Michael says it best, teaching teachers to teach, teachers to teach, teachers to teach. And that's what it is. You teach. You encourage. I love the way Paul said it, apt to teach. And that's what it's all about. That's why all of us are here. That's what you're doing, apt to teach, because your love is so great for other people, and you've been through stuff, and you want to share how not to go through stuff, or at least how to get through that stuff and survive it. Apt to teach. That's what it's all about. Let's all stand.